Shalom, hello everyone. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. Good evening to those of you in Israel, and good afternoon to those of you in Europe or North America, where I think it's the afternoon. Welcome to the latest in our series of events in English that we've been running every Wednesday at this time for the past 10 months or so. We've been meeting different academics and journalists and writers and activists and talking about different issues around Israel, the Middle East, the Jewish world, and other things that are of interest to the people that attend programs at the Begin Center. And I want to, because of what's happening in Israel right now, we have an international, I've been told that there's a noise. Can anyone else hear a loud noise with me talking? Okay, so it might just be the person who heard it. Okay, those of you in Israel will know that things are pretty tense right now. And I do want to say that there's a possibility that there will be a siren here in Jerusalem during the course of this program, in which case I will have to run to the safe room here, and we will take a break until I'm back, so 5 or 10 minutes. So if that happens, then I'll ask those of you that don't have to run to a safe room to stay at your computers and to await the return of those of us who've been forced to vacate the rooms that we're in right now. Okay, we're going to be talking about anti-Semitism, and very specifically about things that are happening in the UK and Europe, and even more specifically, a debate around the definition of anti-Semitism, and a specific definition of anti-Semitism which has been used and adopted by governments and institutions around the world. The IHRA definition, I think I'll try and get this right, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, I believe, definition. And we have with us today Dr. David Hirsh, senior lecturer in sociology at Goldsmiths College at the University of London, who is really one of the foremost writers and activists about anti-Semitism in Europe. He's been part of that issue and a leading player in that arena since 2005, when he co-founded the Engage website, which was a resource for those working to oppose the academic boycott of Israel. He wrote a book in 2018 called Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, a great read, a really important response to the rise of Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party, in the British Labour Party, and looking at the whole issue of anti-Semitism on the left. And we're very happy to have him with us today. David, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Hi.
Let's start. I'm gonna have a conversation with David for about 20-30 minutes. I'd ask you to write in questions in the chat box in your Zoom, which we can get to at the end of my conversation with David, and I'll put some of those questions to David. So let's start with the basics. David, if you can explain to us what is the IHRA definition broadly. What is it about it that makes it so appealing for so many institutions and governments to adopt? And what is the Jerusalem Declaration, which is this new attempt at a different definition, which is really stands in opposition to the IHRA definition?
Okay, so I will try to talk briefly, and I'll try to make it more of a conversation than a lecture, but having said that, I'll probably need to be stopped. So the IHRA definition has a long history, actually. It was only adopted by the IHRA, by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2016. It comes out of discussions a long time ago. It comes out of discussions after 1989 in Europe, and in particular in the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was trying, after the fall of communism, to recreate a foundation for a new democratic Europe. And part of that was discussing and setting guarantees against racism and anti-Semitism and such things. The other key thing, I think, was the Durban World Conference Against Racism. I don't know if people have heard of it or they know much about it. It was held in 2001 in Durban in the New South Africa, and it was a conference about racism. And it was supposed to be a conference which would talk about where the struggle against global racism moves after having defeated apartheid. And it was a huge conference. It was NGOs and governments and UN in Durban on the seafront in a cricket ground, 20,000 people there. And there was a huge and rather successful campaign to portray Zionism as the key racism on the planet after the fall of apartheid. So this whole conference, which was supposed to be about racism, focused on Israel and the so-called evil of Zionism, and Zionism is racism and all that stuff. And there was swirls of rhetoric, some of it openly anti-Semitic, some of it anti-Zionist, some of it kind of careful not to be anti-Semitic, and some of it legitimate criticism of Israel. And it all swirled around at this conference in a kind of huge and terrifying way. The week after this conference was 9/11. And a few months before it was what may turn out to have been the end of the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So this is quite a moment. The Jewish NGOs go home from Durban actually quite upset. Some of them couldn't go home because there was a mushroom cloud over Lower Manhattan. It was a big moment. Durban is symbolic for me of the kind of resurgence of Zionism as racism and political anti-Semitism. And of course, 9/11 is symbolic of really the kind of upsurge of jihadi Islamist movements. The NGOs went back actually to the OSCE and the European Union, and they said, this kind of anti-Semitism is a problem, right? This kind, which, we saw first in the Soviet Union many decades ago, which we saw in 1968 in East Germany and Poland, in 1951 in Czechoslovakia. This kind of anti-Semitism, which says that Israel is a unique evil on the planet, and that Zionism is racism, and that Israel is symbolic of everything bad in the world, and that Israel is a kind of keystone of the global system of imperialism, modernity, capitalism, whatever you call it. Yeah. You know what a keystone is? It's in an arch. It's the piece, the one piece that shapes to hold the whole thing up, right? So this kind of anti-Semitism put Israel back at the center of everything evil in the world, which is, of course, where anti-Semitism always sits. So to cut a long story short, the thing about IHRA, or the EUMC definition, which it was originally, is that it takes this kind of anti-Semitism seriously. So forward 20 years, nearly. And the thing about IHRA is that when Jews in a university or in a country or in a city, they want to go to their institution and they want to say, take this kind of anti-Semitism seriously as well. Take the kind of anti-Semitism seriously, which comes at us and accuses us of being Zionists, meaning racists, meaning evil, meaning all of the things that it is said to mean. People always ask me, what is the real meaning of Zionism? What is Zionism really? And I'm always kind of reluctant to have that conversation, because in this context, the important meaning of Zionism, in the context of anti-Semitism, the meaning of Zionism is racist, right? If somebody calls you a Zionist, if somebody designates you as a Zionist, they're saying that you're a racist, and they're saying that you're evil, and they're saying that you're outside of you know, the normal community of decent human beings.
It's the real meaning of Zionism. What is Zionism really?
I just got a strange bit of my own voice back at me. Shall I carry on? Is all good?
Yeah, please do.
It's gone quiet again. Maybe there's a... All right. What IHRA does is it gives examples, a number of examples of things which we know are frequently anti-Semitic. For example, accusing Israel of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel than to their own country, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. It's quite interesting wording because it's always misworded. I can go into that one in more detail, actually, so let me just carry on for a moment.
Yeah.
Applying double standards, using symbols or images associated with classic anti-Semitism about Israel, drawing comparisons of Israel to Nazism. So what it does is it gives examples of the kinds of things that we know are often anti-Semitic, and it says that the institution should make a judgment according to context about whether the case in question is anti-Semitic. So the thing about IHRA is that it is a very, very tame document, right? It says, these are the kinds of things that we know are very often anti-Semitic. If you see a case like it, then you're going to have to make a judgment. There's no automatic, there's no app for your iPhone that can do it for you. You're going to have to make a political judgment according to context. And by the way, then IHRA says, criticism of Israel, which is the same as criticism leveled against any other democratic state, is not anti-Semitic. So there's no caveat, there's no context, simply criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. So IHRA is tame. IHRA gives you a number of examples of things that we know are anti-Semitic. IHRA is important because it positions this kind of anti-Semitism as being significant, and that's what IHRA does. Now,
so just to maybe sharpen it, if in the current situation that we're in right now, where there's obviously a lot of criticism of Israel going around on social media and elsewhere, most of that criticism of Israel, criticizing the way Israel's reacting to Hamas in Gaza, criticizing Israel around the decisions to evacuate Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah, all the things around the tension here in the last few days, none of that is it would be classed as anti-Semitic by the IHRA definition, unless the person making that criticism was also saying, and because of this, Israel has no right to exist. There should not be an Israel. For example.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. There has been a lot of anti-Semitic stuff going around social media relating to the current conflict.
Indeed.
But it is stuff, for example, which accuses Jewish societies and universities of being murderers, child killers, baby killers, double standards. You know, Israel is essentially necessarily racist, all of that kind of stuff. So there's plenty of anti-Semitic stuff going around. But IHRA is careful, and IHRA doesn't do the job for you. Let me tell you something else then. The story, there's a link before I go on to the Jerusalem Declaration, is that generally people on the left and people in academia, they don't like it when you raise the issue of anti-Semitism, when you say, well, this kind of hostility or this kind of boycott movement brings with it anti-Semitic feeling and anti-Semitic emotions and anti-Semitic rhetoric and anti-Semitic, you know, people don't like it, right? And they say anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism, it's a critique of an idea, and it's not a racism against Jews. And if you persist and if you kind of offer examples with Jeremy Corbyn, you say, well, yeah, he was paid by the Iranian regime to do their English language propaganda, or he legitimized an anti-Semitic mural, or he declared that particular British Zionists didn't understand English irony, or, on and on and on, the kinds of things that Jeremy Corbyn did.
There's a long list, yeah.
Right. So if you do any of that, then you will be accused of disloyalty, right? And the assumption will be that you know very well that Jeremy Corbyn is not anti-Semitic, you know very well that he's a very nice man, but you're saying that in order to delegitimize his criticism of Israel. You're saying that in order to pretend that his criticism of Israel is illegitimate in the way that everybody accepts that anti-Semitism is illegitimate, right? This is something that I've called the Livingston formulation, because Ken Livingston did it quite a long time ago. Probably most of you have some vague idea of who he is. But the structure of the denial is very, very important. You raise the issue of anti-Semitism and you say, I'm worried about, this lecturer who accuses his students of being members of the JSOC and therefore Zionist and therefore racist, right? And if you say
JSOC is Jewish, for those not in the UK, JSOC is the Jewish Society.
Sorry, like the Hillel.
Yeah.
And if you say this is, in effect, an anti-Semitic way of relating to your students, then people will say this is a terrible lie. They will do an absolute denial and they'll do a counter accusation. And we know what you're up to. You're not a proper sociologist. You're not a proper left activist, but really you're somebody who's lying for Israel, and you're trying to pretend that this or that thing that somebody said is anti-Semitic in order to delegitimize it. And that is the key way in which Jews get excluded, right? There's the way that Jewish members of the Labour Party got bullied and excluded, was that they would raise issues. The Jewish labor movement was quite well organized. They would raise issues. They would talk about things that people had said. Some of them, absolutely explicit and awful things that people had said. And they would then be characterized as enemies. Enemies, why? Because they were pretending that there was anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, when really what they were trying to do was to delegitimize Jeremy Corbyn's criticism of Israel and to smear the left and to stop Corbyn getting elected. And then, of course, sometimes because Corbyn was a threat to capitalism and not only Zionism and imperialism. So you can see how the connections are made.
Right.
But it's the key way that Jews were informally kicked out, right? If you said there was an issue of anti-Semitism, and this was true in my trade union around the argument about the academic boycott of Israel, if you said there's an issue of anti-Semitism here, you would be told that you didn't accept the values of the union. I mean, I can give more examples of that. One recent one from South Africa is very interesting. A Jewish guy was nominated for the Constitution Court in South Africa, which is like the Supreme Court. And the BDS campaign, the boycott campaign, said that because this judge has been on the board of deputies of South African Jews, then he's a Zionist. The board is Zionist, therefore he's a Zionist because he has a relationship with the board, therefore he's a racist, therefore he's a supporter of apartheid, and therefore he cannot be on the Constitution Court because he doesn't share the values of the South African nation, right? Okay, so of course, this is what was generally said about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It was said that the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism was a kind of pretend instrument which is used to pretend that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic.
And just to be clear, the IHRA definition by this point, right, has been adopted by a number of governments and civic institutions and private institutions around the world, including in many or most democratic countries. Is that right? That's
right. Well, IHRA itself is a governmental organization. It's an organization that governments send delegates to. So whatever it was, the 17 members of IHRA adopted it. The US State Department adopted it. Many universities around the world adopted it. The Football Association adopted it. And when these institutions adopt IHRA, what they're doing is very simple. They're saying, we recognize this kind of anti-Semitism to be real and to be significant. And we affirm that if we see a case, then we will make a judgment according to context, which is what IHRA tells us to do. So,
okay, so let's move on to the Jerusalem Declaration.
Right. So there was a lot of hostility to IHRA. The people who were hostile to IHRA were the people who wanted to do the things that IHRA seemed to say were often anti-Semitic, right? And a lot of kind of extravagant claims were made for IHRA, that IHRA prohibits criticism of Israel. As I've just told you, IHRA explicitly legitimizes criticism of Israel as not anti-Semitic, right? But it's absolutely standard for opponents of IHRA to run around saying IHRA says that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. IHRA says that being, against Israel is anti-Semitic, and all the rest of it. In my university, I mean, this is happening at the moment. There's a woman who teaches in the history department who is going around teaching her students that if IHRA is adopted by the university, then her course on Israel and Palestine will be prohibited, right? Which A, is completely untrue, B, is basically impossible, and C, what is it that she's doing which
right.
somebody might say violates the IHRA definition? But they're going around teaching their students that the British government, the Tory government, and the administration of the university and the Zionists are trying to prohibit freedom of expression. About, basically they're trying to prohibit support for the Palestinians and a serious study of Palestinian history.
Yeah. And
that's what people think. So what's happened recently is that a bunch of people who hated IHRA put together a kind of competing definition, right, out of their heads, and the interesting bit of what they call the Jerusalem Declaration is
because it was signed in Jerusalem, right? It was signed in a meeting in Jerusalem. Is that right?
Well, that's
ironically. Is that right?
I don't even know if it was. I mean, it's a kind of it's a name. So hang on, I'm just trying to find the passage. I can't find it off the top of my head. Oh, here it is. So what the Jerusalem IHRA starts with the world, right? As I told you, it came out of Durban. It came out of the fall of communism. It came out of a complex kind of wish to recognize this kind of anti-Semitism. Why? Because it was seen in the world. Jerusalem Declaration doesn't start by looking at anti-Semitism. It starts by looking at IHRA, right? It starts by looking at IHRA, and remember that it believes that IHRA is a Jewish and Trumpist and Zionist and Tory plot to silence criticism of Israel. Right? It's nasty, right? If it was true, it would be a very nasty thing to do. So what they've done is they've listed the key elements of anti-Semitism, of this kind of anti-Semitism as it appears in the world, right? In a trade union, in a Labour Party, in a church. The key elements of this kind of anti-Semitism are a campaign to boycott Israel, a campaign to create so much anger with Israel as a whole that you are moved to exclude Israeli academics from your campus or Israeli sports people from your football pitch or whatever. Israel eliminationism, it's clear that it wants to legitimize ways of thinking which hope for and campaign for the end of Israel. It talks about unreasonable, disproportionate, and intemperate speech. It talks about singling out Israel and double standards against Israel. It talks about the analogies, right? Analogies with older situations, which obviously in this context means the apartheid analogy and the Nazism analogy and the settler colonialism analogy. And what Jerusalem says is it lists these things and it says they are not in and of themselves anti-Semitic, right? BDS boycotts are not in and of themselves anti-Semitic. Israel eliminationism is not in and of itself anti-Semitic. Unreasonable, disproportionate, intemperate speech are not in and of themselves anti-Semitic. Now, it's obvious to anyone who thinks about it for a moment that none of these things ever appear in and of themselves, right? They appear in a social movement. They appear in a Labour Party, they appear in a church, they appear in a food co-op, they appear in a trade union, and they appear as part of a social movement. And they appear as part of a campaign to make people so kind of angry and disgusted with Israel. It's Nazi, it's apartheid. It should be excluded from the world community, right? So these elements, which in the real world are part of this kind of anti-Semitism, are kind of legitimized in the abstract. So IHRA starts with the world, and it says, we can see a kind of anti-Semitism in the world that we want to describe in a definition. Jerusalem starts with IHRA. It starts with the bad behavior of Jews, right? Jews and Trumpists and Tories. And it starts in its own head. It says, when I imagine boycotts, or when I imagine Israel eliminationism, or when I imagine an apartheid analogy, it's not in and of itself anti-Semitic. That wasn't the question, right? The question is not, is it anti-Semitic in and of itself? The question is it anti-Semitic in this context as part of this movement, you know, on the 27th of June, 2020, right? And
but by saying that these things are explicitly not anti-Semitic, it allows, it essentially gives the green light for these things to happen. And it basically says, you are not allowed, am I right? It says you are not allowed to call these things anti-Semitism. You're not allowed to connect these things to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is only, and then what does it say anti-Semitism is? How does it, what would the Jerusalem Declaration class as anti-Semitism?
I haven't got the whole text in my head. There are some things that it does say are anti-Semitic, funnily enough, with less caveat than IHRA, actually. So the things that it does define as anti-Semitic, it doesn't even talk about context. The key problem is this kind of legitimation of these elements of discourse in the abstract. And the point, of course, I mean, law never talks about anything in the abstract. Law talks about things in their context, in reality, in the material world. And that's, of course, the same with any kind of definition, right? If you want to define anything, right? You want to define gold. You need to know something about gold, right? You need to do a material scientific research into gold, and you find out that it is the element with the atomic number 97, and then you define gold as the element with the atomic number 97, right? If you want to define anti-Semitism, you look at the world, you see that there is this kind of anti-Semitism, and you create a policy or a definition which describes it. Jerusalem doesn't do that. Jerusalem starts in my head, and it says, when I think of it in the abstract, it's not anti-Semitic. There's a name for that philosophical fallacy. I don't remember what it is, but it's answering a question which was not asked.
I mean, one of the ways in which it strikes me that this is very insidious is that we can see it, in fact, very clearly right now on social media that what starts with the anti-Zionist stuff can very quickly becomes really sort of unabashed, unequivocal anti-Semitism. You can see it you know, what some, you know, a Palestine solidarity campaign or a Free Palestine campaign, if you scroll down the Twitter feed, it's not very, you don't get very far before you see a Hitler was right or a protocols thing, right? That's, and I think about the last time we had a big Israel-Gaza conflict was in 2014, when I think it was then when you had that incident in Paris where an anti-Israel demonstration ended up with a mob trying to batter down the doors of a synagogue, of a French synagogue.
Yeah,
not the Israeli embassy or anything specifically Israeli, right?
It's one of the things that you always see with anti-Zionism. You see with boycott movements. You see with movements for, you know, against IHRA. What happens is that the people who kind of lead these movements are very often quite smart and apparently legitimate, right? And you know, Jeremy Corbyn very rarely said anything that was explicitly anti-Semitic. But what you almost have to feel sorry for them, because what happens is that their supporters come out of the woodwork from all sides and they say, yeah, you know, you're only having a go at Jeremy Corbyn because you're rich and you want to support capitalism, right? Or people come out of, you know, in Liverpool and support Jeremy Corbyn against Luciana Berger's criticism, and they say kind of awful misogynist anti-Semitic things. They say she's the MP for Tel Aviv Central, you know, all of this kind of explicitly anti-Semitic things. And these poor kind of nice anti-Zionists must be kind of furious. And what it tells us is that anti-Zionism kind of, it can never hold back the anti-Semitism, which is easy for everybody to recognize. It can never kind of seal it off. Why? Because nearly all anti-Zionism, and we know this from experience, from empirical study, when it gets loose in a social movement, it releases anti-Semitic tropes, it releases anti-Semitic emotions, and it becomes an anti-Semitic movement.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. That's really informative and gives us a really good understanding of what this debate around the definitions is about. I'm gonna invite people to write questions in about that. While they do that, while they think of questions, I want to just change tack a little bit and really sort of take advantage of having you with us, someone who's thought about and written about anti-Semitism for a very long time, to just give us your thoughts on the wider issue of anti-Semitism today. There's a general consensus, I think, that anti-Semitism is on the rise. There's been there seems to be a lot of debate in the United States about anti-Semitism that, that comes from both sides. It comes from the right and the left, and it's a different kind of anti-Semitism. Maybe on the left, it's more similar to what you've been talking about. And on the right, it's a more sort of, shall we say, kind of good old-fashioned anti-Semitism of the far right and white supremacy. And unfortunately, anti-Semitism has become this kind of political tool, at least in the US, where the left are only talking about the anti-Semitic. I mean, this is a generalization. There are some good people who are taking a stand more broadly, but I think what's happening a lot of times is that people on the left are pointing to anti-Semitism on the right and also blaming Donald Trump and people around Trump for emboldening white supremacy, and they're not looking at the left-wing anti-Semitism coming from their own camp. And on the right, the same thing is happening in reverse, that no one's looking at the anti-Semitism that's coming from their own side. Can you speak to that a little bit? Is that something that you've thought about and observed yourself?
Absolutely. Quickly, by the way, I will answer Michelle's question, though. That judge didn't get appointed to the Constitutional Court, and honestly, I cannot tell you if that was a significant reason or not.
The judge in South Africa. we're talking
yeah,
about.
he didn't get the job. And the other thing about the South Africa example is that it's a very beautiful example of a movement which is very careful not to say anything which can be easily, explicitly recognized as anti-Semitic, right? What they said was this guy who has had a connection with his Jewish community does not share the values of South Africa because he's a racist, right? But there is nothing in that which could, for example, which could be deemed to be anti-Semitic according to the Jerusalem Declaration, or according to somebody who says that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitic and it's only anti-Semitic if it has old-fashioned anti-Semitic tropes with it. Because I mean, it's kind of arguable, but I think it's a kind of classic case of, and they defend it. You know, they say, no, we weren't against him because he was Jewish. We were against him because he had this link to the community. The community is Zionist, therefore he's Zionist, therefore he's racist, therefore he doesn't share the values. Let me come back onto your question. The question is about right-wing and left-wing anti-Semitism. So firstly, I think this is very important. Very often I hear people, and sometimes quite subtly and sometimes not subtly, saying, well, look, you know, the anti-Semitism around me in my political family on the left, or the anti-Semitism around me in my political family on the right, yeah, there is some, but it's not really significant. What is really significant is the others, right? So on the right, people say what is really significant is left-wing anti-Semitism and Islamist anti-Semitism. Yeah. And on the left, they say, yeah, you know, there's some idiots around, but what's really significant, what's the real threat to Jews is the right. And every time I hear that kind of, you know, their anti-Semitism is real and my anti-Semitism is just a little kind of local family difficulty, always a problem. And the reason it's a problem is because both sides legitimize the anti-Semitism around them. And people say to me sometimes, I mean, I come from a left tradition, right? And I'm a sociologist, for goodness sake, which is kind of, you know, left politics with a
you're not allowed to be a Tory if you're a sociologist.
Yeah, don't get me started. But so now you put me off.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's all right. People say to me, you know, why do you only write about left anti-Semitism? You know, what about the right? And the reason I always wrote about left anti-Semitism, the reason I was concerned about it was, firstly, I could see it around me. I could understand it because it was around me politically and geographically. And I hated it because it was destroying my own political family, right? The question, to go further about what's happening in terms of anti-Semitism more generally, you see, I think, and people might disagree with me, I think that there is something that's been happening for the last 5 years or so, certainly in European politics and in American politics, is that I think things have changed quite significantly and quite quickly. And what I think is that we have a kind of populist politics that has been very radical and really quite frightening, and which has changed the way that people think. If you look at the way Donald Trump ruled, was the president or was the head of the Republican Party, he was significantly different from what came before him in right-wing politics in America. And this is true also of the Brexit movement, which kind of arrived out of nowhere. It said the real problem is foreigners over there telling us what to do and foreigners over here taking our jobs. And everything in Britain is really corrupted by these foreigners who take away our freedom, they take away our sovereignty. And the liberal elite in the cities are colluding with it, right? The liberal elite in Islington, in London, are selling our sovereignty, our Britishness, our jobs to the foreigners. And you remember Trump saying the same thing. So populism is a way of kind of making everything simple, of making the people into this kind of one thing. And for me, it's very reminiscent of certain aspects of 20th century totalitarian thinking and totalitarian movements. The democratic state is a kind of complex way of mediating sort of huge diversity of human beings, right? You know, millions of human beings with different interests and different talents and different classes and different gender and different, you know, wants and needs. And the democratic state is complicated. There, you know, all kinds of civil society organizations and legal organizations and parliaments, and we each get our voice heard in some way in the big machine. That's how it's supposed to work. Populism comes along and says, it's all fake, right? The democratic state is fundamentally fake. It's fundamentally been stolen by this liberal metropolitan elite, by Clinton, by Blair, by David Cameron, by Macron. It's been stolen by the elite, which pretends to be nice, it pretends to be liberal, it pretends to be against racism, but we know the truth, and the truth is it's only out there to steal stuff. And the newspapers pretend to be free, but we know that it's all fake news. And all of the, you know, in the Brexit fight, there were sort of screaming headlines in the Daily Mail accusing High Court judges of being enemies of the people and all the rest of it. And you might say to me, what has this got to do with anti-Semitism? Well, I'll tell you, which is that both on the left and on the right, there are these histories of anti-Semitism being similar to and attracted to anti-democratic politics. Anti-democratic politics is fundamentally conspiracy fantasy, right? There is this hidden liberal elite, there is this hidden 1%, there is this hidden machine which is exploiting you and which is pretending that you have a nice democratic state. But really, there's this global conspiracy which is stealing your rights and stealing your country. And the anti-Semitic notion of the Jew is evolved over many centuries in many very different contexts to offer a way of emotionally visualizing the enemy. And 20th century totalitarianism offered the Jew as a way of visualizing the rootless cosmopolitan, the polluter of the race, and all the rest of it. Now, I don't think it's true that Brexit and Trump, for example, have really kind of explored that potentiality, but I think the potential is there. When you define the enemy as the people who live in the cities, the liberals, the educated, the middle class, the judges, the cosmopolitans, the people with more connection to other countries than to their own salt of the earth, white working class. When you connect it to things like bankers and finance capital, it is only a kind of cigarette paper away from anti-Semitism.
Right,
it's attractive to anti-Semitism. It's similar.
Yeah, it's like the populists themselves don't need to be anti-Semitic or even interested in this issue, but they've legitimized a worldview which makes it very easy for anti-Semites.
Yep. Well, what we know, I mean, also we know this from the left. We know this from the boycott movement and the anti-Zionist movement. We know that somebody will come along and say, you know, we need to win power. We need to win number 10 Downing Street. And the people stopping us are the Zionists, right? On the left, it's rhetoric around Zionism. Why do the Zionists want to stop us? Because the Zionists are in favor of capitalism and they're in favor of imperialism, and they don't want criticism. So I think there are many, many hundreds of people in Britain who have learnt from the defeat of the whole Corbyn movement, who have learnt that between us and socialism sits the Zionists, and what they mean by that are the Jewish communities. And similarly, I think that's true. I mean, I think that's true in the United States, right? That Trump was very, very clear that the election itself was faked. The election was stolen. All of those people you saw on CNN for 5 days counting ballots, they were all corrupt. They were all part of a conspiracy. And it seems to me that Anti-Semitism is a kind of way of visualizing the enemy of the people. Anti-Semitism is related to anti-democratic politics, and that should frighten both Jews and everybody else, actually, because everyone has an interest in a democratic state, I think.
Right. So, okay, let's go on to questions. I was actually going to, if I'd had more time, I was going to ask you about France, but Judah Weinraub has beaten me to it, and he asks if you could address the anti-Semitism in France, where there is an alliance between Islamists and leftists, and we should all be aware of the horrible murder of Sarah Halimi, and the equally horrible decision to let off her murderer on the grounds that he was high.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect possibly I don't know much more about France than any of you do. One thing that's interesting about France is people ask why is the anti-Zionism so big in Britain? Why did it kind of kick off in Britain? Why did the boycott movement begin in Britain? And I always think that in Britain there's colonial guilt, but there's no Holocaust guilt, right? The Brits, in fact, think of themselves as the kind of heroes of the Holocaust. They saved the Jews, right? And I've heard that said by British people. So the Brits are the heroes of the Holocaust, but they have colonial guilt, and they have guilt about having given Palestine to the Jews, right? Germany, of course, is the opposite. There's a lot of Holocaust guilt around, but there's no colonial guilt. And in France, you have this kind of quite interesting kind of mixture of both Vichy and Algeria.
Right.
So you have kind of both. You have both Holocaust guilt and you have colonial guilt. And many of the Jews in France come from Algeria and actually live in much the same neighborhoods as other people who came from, Muslims who came from Algeria. And so you have a kind of particular French issue going on there.
What about the specific point that he makes about the Islamist leftist alliance? Because that's also something that I think is familiar to the British experience.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I couldn't really speak specifically about France on that. For sure, that they have certain kinds of politics in common, right? That a certain kind of anti-imperialist and Stalinist left has quite a lot politically in common with a certain kind of white, anti-Christian Islamist right. And what they have in common is this worldview that, you know, Europe and America, the democratic states are really the center of the global machine of oppression. And the global machine of oppression, you can call it what you like. You can call it modernity or capitalism or imperialism, or you can call it Christianity. Keep your eye on the ball, because that's the global organized enemy of mankind, right? And so that's one of the reasons why Zionism fits into that kind of global system as a keystone, and then anti-Semitism fits into this worldview of good and bad, and it's a worldview that puts democratic states at the heart of everything bad in the world. So in general, you know, if you go to a university and you're a kind of Stalinist, anti-imperialist leftist, you have quite a lot in common with your kind of soft Islamist mates. Which is a worldview, and which is also a kind of notion that Muslims are the kind of symbolic oppressed of the world, and the Palestinians are the symbolic oppressed of the Muslims. And the main reason for that in the end is because actually Israelis are the symbolic oppressors. So Israel and Palestine becomes a kind of symbolic story that everyone around the world can get on board with, right? We can all tell you, I can tell you who I am by telling you how I fit into this sort of story of Israel and Palestine. And of course, you know, I mean, everybody knows, for example, that the big conflict in the Middle East is between Saudi Arabia and Iran, is between, you know, Sunni and Shia, is like much bigger, more powerful forces than little Israel and little Palestine, actually. but that's not interesting. It's not part of the kind of imagination of a kind of shared story. But I'm kind of rabbiting a bit, really, because basically I don't know much about specifics about France. So,
okay, I just have a comment here from one of our listeners that pointing out that you have a lot of disaffected North Africans in France. There has been, I think, not to focus too much on France, but there has been, I think, a failure of France to integrate this North African population, and you have this kind of perfect storm of unemployment and undereducation and the presence of Islamist ideology.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm kind of less and less sympathetic to that argument, and I'll tell you what I'm thinking. I'm thinking it may be true, but it may not be quite as true as you say, but it may be true that, you know, there's high unemployment and there's slums and there's bad education and there's Islamophobia and there's racism, right? And that might make people angry. But they should then be angry about racism and Islamophobia and education and housing and unemployment, right? There is no reason to then adopt a politics of whatever, blaming the Jews or blaming, whatever else. So it seems to me a really important point in explaining populism and also understanding 20th century totalitarianism. You know, Versailles was not good to Germany, right? But if you wanted to campaign against Versailles, campaign against Versailles. If you want to be angry with Versailles, be angry with Versailles. It was nothing to do with the Jews, right? So as an explanation, there's a great big kind of autonomous realm of culture and politics in between some notion of a kind of rational resentment, a rational grievance on the one hand, and blaming the European Union for it on the other, right? You know, people in Britain might have been cross, but it wasn't the fault of the European Union. So you cannot explain Brexit simply by saying people were cross. You have to say, yeah, people might have been cross, but why did they adopt this politics and these ideas and not that? You know,
and one reason, of course, is because there were people there were people with enough charisma or political nous to convince them that the EU was the legitimate target.
Okay, but then I think you have to have a certain amount of respect for people, and you have to look, you know, if people are at a Trump rally chanting "lock her up" and chanting, you know, Muslims, not Muslims, Mexicans, you know, build the wall and keep out the Muslims, you have to kind of respect them enough to believe that that's what they actually want, right? And what they don't really mean is that, you know, we're angry that our car factory in Michigan was closed down, but because whatever, you know, in 1980, right? You have to listen to what people are actually saying and relate to that instead of saying, you know, really, people voted for Trump and Brexit because they're dissatisfied with neoliberalism. And by the way, I'm dissatisfied with neoliberalism, and therefore I'm going to say that their resentment is really a kind of representation of my resentment. I think no, actually, you have to take seriously what people say and what they believe.
Okay, let's go to another question. This is a bit of a more personal question in a way. Michelle is asking, what began your intense study of anti-Semitism? How did you get into this?
Well, that's a difficult question and an easy question. The thing, gosh, it is a difficult question. Easy. In 2005, I was a member of trade union. I had a kind of, I finally had become, about the age of 30, I got a proper job, right? I was a university lecturer. I was very proud of that. I had a proper job. I had a PhD. I also had kids and everything was going good. And I was in a trade union. And my trade union started, there was a campaign to boycott Israeli academics. And somebody sent me a letter to sign, actually, against the boycott. And I read it and I just thought, this letter's not very good. I could write this better. And so I did. And I kind of got into a whole load of politics, which I hadn't been around for many years because I'd been doing other things. I'd been doing my PhD and having my kids and the rest of it. And I actually thought this is going to be fun because I'm going to make very clear, ordinary democratic arguments against boycotting Israel, and I'm going to make arguments in favor of the peace movement in Israel and against anti-Semitism and against racism against the Palestinians, and I'm going to make arguments for a Palestinian state, and it's going to be easy. And it really, really wasn't easy. And I should have known, you know, because I had been around the student movement in the 1980s. I had been around 1980s campaigns to expel Jewish societies from student unions on the basis, as now familiar even from this talk, which is that they were Zionist and therefore racist and therefore incompatible with the spirit of the student movement and all that. But in fact, that campaign against the boycott was very difficult. It hurt. We came across all kinds of awfulness in the union and also within my own department. And the key point of the awfulness is that I felt that I was no longer understood as a colleague, as a union colleague, or as an academic colleague. I was no longer a sociologist, but suddenly I was a Zionist sociologist, which meant a pretend sociologist, a sociologist who's pretending to teach sociology, but really is an apologist for a foreign apartheid racist state, right? And when people start thinking about you in that way, it's really upsetting. And, you know, I and many people that I was working with in that boycott campaign, we moved from being in a quite confident position, into feeling completely marginalized, and it wasn't nice and it hurt. And I have a kind of feeling, a pet theory, if you like, that not many people understand this form of anti-Semitism, because the people who really understand it are the people who've actually felt it and experienced it. Yeah. And in a sense, not that many people have. People in Israel, for example, haven't in general, right? But I mean, and then, I mean, of course, I got interested. I met a woman in a conference in Prague, actually, who told me her story was fascinating. To cut a long story short, her daddy was a fighter pilot. She was born in Wales. Her daddy was a fighter pilot. He was from Czech. He was in the RAF. He was a big war hero. And then in 1945, he wanted to go back to Czechoslovakia to build socialism because he was a socialist, right? He went back, and by 1951, at the time of the Slansky trial, the big boss of socialism in Czechoslovakia and 11 of his Jewish mates were hung, right? And they were accused of the crime of bourgeois Jewish nationalism and Zionism, and they were convicted and they were hung. And this woman's daddy was sent to the uranium mine. And, you know, what I went through was nothing like that. You know, these guys in the union didn't have a uranium mine. I was very pleased. But it's that kind of experience of feeling that you belong, feeling that you're part of it, feeling that you're legitimate, and then getting chewed up and spat out. There's another story of the feminist movement. Have people heard of Spare Rib? It was a radical feminist magazine in the, I think, late 70s, early 80s. Again, at one moment, the Jewish women who were part of this feminist collective were challenged to denounce Zionism, or they were not part of this, you know, feminist collective that they felt themselves to be part of.
The contemporary, it sounds, I mean, what you're describing, the contemporary equivalent of that, it just strikes me, is the experience of Jewish activists in the gay rights movement in America, yep, who were told that they weren't allowed to display the Pride Parade. Yeah. They had the LGBT rainbow flag with a Magen David on it, yeah, because they were Jewish, and they were told they weren't allowed to do this because it looked too much like an Israeli flag.
Yeah, and because
and therefore you know, you can't do that because that means you're a Zionist. So it's a discrimination and a making a pariah of someone for in this case, and also in your case, not even for being some sort of, you know, gung-ho Zionist, but simply for taking a view against the anti-Israel, the extreme and irrational anti-Israel position of the leadership.
It's not criticism of Israel. You can criticize Israel as much as you like, but unless you're willing to legitimize anti-Semitism, you're not allowed in the community of the good, right? What gets you excluded from the community of the good is saying, look, I think, you know, in the ways in which the BDS campaigned against this judge in South Africa, I think really it was anti-Semitism. I think it was anti-Semitism in its content. I suspect it was probably motivated by some kind of underlying anti-Semitism, but certainly it was anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic in its effect and in the way it educated comrades to think about a white Jewish judge. So yeah, people can Google this thing I call the Livingston formulation, and it's a very simple thing. And once you've heard about it, you'll see it absolutely everywhere. If somebody raises the issue of anti-Semitism, they're then told that really they don't even believe it, but they're just saying that in order to silence criticism of Israel. And I found amazing examples. There's Wilhelm Marr, when he wrote his book, which coined the term anti-Semitism. In the introduction, he wrote that he warned against Jews pretending that there was something disgraceful about his book, and his book is really, you know, just an interesting interaction with politics, and they will say that I'm evil. And, you know, Charles Lindbergh, in America, when he was campaigning against the American entry into the Second World War, used the same formulation. He said, you know, we are saying that this is a Jewish war, and it's a war in the interests of the Jews, and it's not in the interests of America. But they will accuse us of anti-Semitism. They will accuse us of anti-Semitism, and they will try to force us into a war by kind of blackmailing us with this accusation. So then anti-Semitism becomes the kind of basis of Jewish power, in fact. So this is right back to the protocols, in fact. One of the protocols talks about the ways in which Jews would use their experience of anti-Semitism to increase their power. And of course, this is also about secondary anti-Semitism and many other things. And you hear it quite often in the context of Israel, that Israel kind of leveraged or exaggerated the Holocaust in order to get a state in return.
Right.
And then, of course, all the other stuff about Israel and Nazism having collaborated and being similar and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
With a straight face, you know?
Right. Yeah, it's like anti-Semitism becomes something which doesn't even really exist unless you're actually a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party and shoving Jews into gas chambers. You're not an anti-Semite. Anti-Semitism becomes something that's almost impossible to accuse anyone of.
I mean, I've got a story I could tell about that actually, but I don't know how much time have we got.
We're running a little bit over. Maybe let's finish with this, and then we'll call it a night.
Okay, the story was, I had a colleague, actually, I'm quite sad because the colleague has since died, but I had a colleague who said to me that she was appearing on a platform in Holland. She was Dutch, she was from Amsterdam, and she was asked to comment on, I don't know if anybody remembers this play called Seven Jewish Children. It was a play written by quite a famous playwright in Britain. And it was fundamentally an anti-Semitic play. It was a play which portrayed Israel's incursion into Gaza as being kind of neurotic and mad and and that Israelis teach their children not to care about Palestinians and not to care about killing and all of this stuff. So I said to my colleague, you went on this panel, did you think the play was anti-Semitic? Did you say it was anti-Semitic? And she looked at me and she said, I can't say that. I couldn't possibly say such a thing in Amsterdam. And I said, why not? She said, well, this is the city of Anne Frank, and this is the city where the Jews were rounded up and taken off to Auschwitz. And you cannot even talk about anti-Semitism. And it's kind of interesting because in a sense, Nazism was quite an unusual kind of anti-Semitism, right? And indeed, Nazism was something that the Jewish leaderships didn't know how to deal with. They thought that they could kind of negotiate with it in a way that they had always negotiated with anti-Semitism before. Nazism was unusual. And if you think that anti-Semitism is only like that, then you will miss it.
Yeah, right. I think that's the critical point. Yeah. Okay, David Hirsh, thank you very, very much for sharing these insights with us and educating us. I, again, recommend David's book, Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, published in 2018. I think David is working on another book right now, so let's look out for that as well. Keep an eye out for David Hirsh on Amazon and Book Depository and good bookstores everywhere. And I wish everyone, those of us in Israel, a safe evening and night and next few days, and let's get through this with our sanity intact.
Can I just say, Paul? I'm just laughing.
Sure.
It says Menachem Begin on your screen, but that's not you.
Yes, that's not me. Yes.
You can find me you can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Twitter. You can Google my Goldsmiths University of London homepage, and there's a link to that, to lots and lots of things that I've written. And kind of Google me, but find me on social media and follow me.
I do, and it's well worth it. I endorse that, and I wish everyone a good day, good evening, and I'll see you hopefully next week. Bye.
Thanks, Paul.